Welcome, everyone. I'll just wait a few seconds for everybody to join us that are watching on Zoom right now. And we should be good to go. So hi, everyone, and welcome to the Barchester Virtual Live events. I hope you're really, really well. If you don't know who I am, I'm Lucy Tomlinson, Resident Experience Manager here at Barchester Healthcare. And welcome to one and all joining us. Today, we return to Blenheim Palace with the lovely Antonia Keaney. If you were with us, if you were with us back in February, Antonia kicked off our virtual event with a look at Lust and Laudanum for Valentine's Day. So we're very happy to have her back. So today we look at life at Blenheim during World War II. This is all in aid of marking Armed Forces Day that takes place this Saturday, the 26th of June. So we are here to look at the times gone by and the World War II at Blenheim Palace to sort of support the men and women who made up the armed forces back then and to those that make them up today. So welcome to all. We've got a number of people watching. We've got about 77 on Zoom and about 23 on YouTube. So welcome to our residents. Hello, our patients, our staffing teams and our community contacts. And you're all very welcome to be here today to learn a little bit more about time gone by at the Palace. So before we meet Antonia, and I know a number of you are already on track and you're already saying it, but if you haven't already, do type in, if you're watching on Zoom, in the chat, say hello and what home you're watching from. And if you're on YouTube, many of you have, and I'll say Austin House, Thistle Hill, Bluebell Park, Wheatlands, Mount Vale, Oak Grange and Stamford Bridge. Welcome on YouTube, and just let us know you're watching so we can say hi to you. Same functionality as usual. So if you have any questions from the content of today or any memories, we're talking about World War II at Blenheim Palace. There's going to be some people that might have some memories they want to share. So pop them in the chat or the comments as well, and I'll read them out as we go along. Remember, if you're watching on Zoom, just check your speaker view, make sure your sound's as up as it can go. And then for everybody that is watching, just consider your fire alarms. Anything happens there, follow your usual protocol. And that leads me very excitedly to introduce Antonia. So Antonia, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's so lovely to be back. And I think all credit to you for having this fantastic initiative, and I'm so delighted to be part of it.
And we are delighted to have you back. It's such a joy. You were one of the first events that we ever had back at Christmas last year. You joined us for 4 events over the Christmas period, which was amazing. And then you came back for us in February, and you're returning to us today. So you were one of the first, Antonio, and we're so grateful that you've been able to come back and help and help us all learn a little bit more about World War II at Blenheim Palace. And learn a little bit of history, which I'm excited to learn more about.
Excellent. So, Lucy, are you happy for me to start?
I am indeed. So, guys, any questions, pop them in. I'll be on screen with Antonia, and I can pop in any of your questions as we go.
Okay, lovely. And I can only reiterate what Lucy said. I think there are all sorts of tales about what went on at Blenheim. And, I'm sure, you have memories from parents, relations, or first-hand memories. And it'll be interesting to see what you make of it. So Blenheim Palace, I mean, during the Second World, well, it had a huge role during the First World War, but during the Second World War, we were actually... we were what's the word? We were invaded twice. We were invaded firstly by a load of stinky schoolboys and then by MI5. But I'll talk to you in more detail, obviously, in a moment. So,
Antonia, before you get into the content, just because I think you're using a Mac PC, if you can just take off the second option. I'm seeing the black box at the top. And I think
hold on just a moment. Yeah,
no worries. There's some technical issues that we try and solve to make so it's the best viewing for everyone, and that should cover it, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so you can see Blenheim Palace in all its magnificence, and as I say, during the First World War, for a short period, we were used as a military hospital, but during the Second World War, far more happened, really. And first of all, to kind of understand the huge change that the Second World War brought about to Blenheim, you need to understand a little bit about how Blenheim was run. So in 1939, it was home to the 10th Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. So one family, and at the start of the war, they had 4 children. And I've got this picture of the bell board that still exists at Blenheim, because really it was run very much as a Victorian estate. You know, so if you were a servant, you would listen out for these bells, you would go to whichever room you were needed in, etc., etc. And who was there, who lived there? So first of all, this is a photograph of the 10th Duke of Marlborough. Now, this is actually a photo of him during the First World War, and he fought in the trenches. By the time the Second World War came along, he was in his early 40s, so he was too old to fight. And what he did from 1941, when the Americans came into the war, he acted as the liaison officer with the American forces in this country. And if you think of it, at the time, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister, and Winston was his cousin. So, you know, he was very well placed to know what could go on at Blenheim and how he might use the family members. So this was the 10th Duke, and here is his wife and his 4 children. So from left to right, we have Lady Sarah, Lady Caroline, and then with the lovely little dachshund on her lap, we have Duchess Mary, Lady Rosemary, and then the young man who grew up to be the 11th Duke of Marlborough. And he died 3 or 4 years, well, 4 years ago now. So they each had something to do during the war. And first of all, the Duchess, I mean, she was an amazing woman. She was born in 1900. Her maiden name was Cadogan, so she came from the aristocracy. But my goodness, she really rolled up her sleeves and got down to work. And her first job was to make sure that Blenheim was as prepared as it possibly could be in case of attack. So she made sure that everyone had a gas mask. She made sure that the beams in the roof were coated in salt and lime to make them fire retardant if possible. And she made sure that they had stirrup pumps. Now, I'm sure you'll kind of have an idea of what a stirrup pump is, but essentially it's a vertical pump with something that looks like a stirrup at the bottom. You put your foot in that, you've got a handle to pump it up and down, and you have a hose that goes into a water source and a hose to direct the water. She had 8 stirrup pumps. Now, in reality, if Blenheim had been bombed and set alight, with its 200 odd rooms, 8 stirrup pumps wasn't going to make any difference. But as far as they were concerned, they were prepared. And that helped a lot. You know, if your mindset is, I've done as much as I possibly can, then you feel you can face anything. So that was part of her job. The other part, the other thing she did, she was actually a very active fundraiser for the Red Cross, and she continued to do that until her dying day. And she was also a commandant in the Auxiliary Territorial Service in the ATS. So as I say, she was very active. She helped run the British restaurant that was in Woodstock, which is the town where Blenheim's situated. So this was somewhere that people could get a substantial meal. But she's pictured there actually after the war, and she's holding the hand of this little boy. And something else she did in 1940, aged 40, was to give birth to her 5th child. And this was a second son. And again, it's interesting. His older sister, who's going to be 92 next year, is still very much, next month, is still very much alive. And, you know, I chatted to her and I said, well, you know, that must have been quite something. And she said, oh, my dear, you know, we were all terribly shocked at the thought of mother having another child. And I said, well, how come? And she said that because they couldn't possibly know how long the war was going to last, and there was only one male heir. Now, if the war had continued and he had gone to fight and been killed, then they needed to make sure that they had another male to succeed to the title. And she was very lucky and gave birth to another son. So there's Lord Charles, her youngest child. And she had a very busy time of it. And I'll come back to her in a moment. This is the girl in the middle there is the elder of the daughters. So Lady Sarah, who we saw a picture of a moment ago. So calling herself Sally Spencer instead of Lady Sarah Spencer Churchill, she took herself off to the local works, which is the plant that now produces minis in Oxford. And that was a munitions factory. So she went off and did her bit there. And ironically, the under butler was actually her foreman. So, you know, you can start to see a whole change in the social hierarchy. So instead of her giving him orders, he was supervising her and giving her orders. But she did that very well. And in fact, she was married in 1943. So the Duchess, having not long since given birth to a child, then organised a marriage. And then a year later, Lady Sarah had a baby. So the Duchess became a granny. So it was a very hectic period. Her younger sister, Lady Caroline, became a VAD nurse in 1944. And here is Lord Blandford, who later became the 11th Duke. Now, this is a photograph of him, aged 14 in 1941, and he's with the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Winston was his godfather, and the Duke was very proud of the fact that Winston was his godfather. And Winston was very, very keen that he should see what was happening in the rest of the country. And this photograph was taken on a visit to Liverpool to see how, you know, the bombings had taken place, how they'd affected people. So, you know, it's all very well living in a palace and going to Eton to school, but it's also very good to have a touch of reality. And I was very lucky. A couple of years before this Duke died, I was able to interview him. And I didn't know him from Adam, and he didn't really know me. And I took along a sheaf of photographs because it's a good way of breaking the ice and getting to chat to someone. And I showed him this and I said, Your Grace, you know, what was it like to visit Liverpool with the Prime Minister? And he said, you know, Uncle Winston was at the front of the train with his people. I was down the back of the train, you know, way ahead of it, out of the thing. So he couldn't remember anything about the journey or whatever. And then he paused and he said, but I remember that coat. And his mother, like everyone else, had clothing rations. And he said she bought the coat 2 or 3 sizes too big. And he clearly hated the coat. And all he could remember of that trip was having to wear this wretched coat that didn't fit him properly, which I thought was rather interesting.
You can say that. You look at the picture and you think that's the first thing you notice, I think.
I mean, it's enormous.
Yeah.
As I say, they had to abide by rationing, quite rightly, just like the rest of the country. And again, I'm sure people will have memories of food rationing and clothing rationing. And we'll hopefully come on to that as we go. The other thing that was going on, so all the local villages had their own home guard, and this is the Woodstock Home Guard. And they, again, it's quite interesting. I do this talk quite frequently. And a few years ago, I was giving this talk in a village a couple of miles away called Coombe. And I was telling them about the Home Guard. And a gentleman at the back of the room piped up and he said, that's me, third from the left. And his name was Geoffrey Green. And sadly, he died a couple of years ago, but he lived to be 100. And his family had been tenant farmers at Blenheim for years and years and years. But he could remember how the Home Guard would come into the park and they would do things like rifle practice. And the rifles were stashed in a little cottage on the estate, and they would have shooting practice. One of the other things that they used to do was that they would drive around the park in the dark. Because again, if you remember, there was curfew as far as lights went and everything. And so it was just good to practice driving around and just trying to see if they could make their way from A to B. And they asked the Duke for permission, and he said, yes, of course. He said, as long as you don't hit any of my blooming cows.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they didn't. And what they really used to love was when the Duchess turned up with what they called the Duchess's van. And in the back of it, from the back of it, she would serve soup and refreshments for them while they were doing their manoeuvres. So she was a thoroughly, thoroughly good egg.
Yeah. I was just going to add, the Duke with the oversized coat. Lyndon House has just wrote in Beryl from Lyndon House has found fond memories of having clothes that Mum would say you will grow into that. I think we all have memories of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think it was probably more of a necessity in those days. You let the hem down, let the sleeves down, turn the collar inside out, all sorts of things.
Yeah, refashion an item into your fit.
Yeah, upcycle.
Absolutely. Ashford has said that looks awesome. I'm assuming the picture that you've got here, fishing in the lake, but tell me more, Ashford, and I'll read it out.
Okay, so the estate, we've got 2,000 acres at Blenheim, and I'll come on to how the gardens were used in a moment, but the lake was used, the palace was used, all sorts of things. So they actually fished the lake for food. But again, Winston spent a lot of time at Blenheim as a child and as a young man, and he knew the estate inside out. And so when it came to it, he knew that the lake and its steep banks would be a really good place to test amphibious vehicles, because when it came to the D-Day landings, they needed to know that the craft could actually come out of the water and get up onto dry land. So that's one of the things that they did with the lake. They also had something called Operation Pluto, and Pluto stands for Pipeline Under the Ocean. And this was an experiment they did to see if they could run a fuel line along the bottom of the lake, because again, there was a necessity to run a cable with fuel across the channel. So there were all sorts of maneuvers and all sorts of kind of experiments going on. But then in October 1939, we were invaded. And we were invaded by a school called Malvern College. Now, Malvern College nestles in the Malvern Hills, and it's a reasonably safe place. But the government knew this and decided that they would like the school for their radar research facility. So they kicked the boys out, moved them to Blenheim, which is very near Oxford, not a million miles away from London, and a much more dangerous place to be, in fact. And you can see that Blenheim weren't, as I say, we are a huge palace, but to house another 400 people was quite a big ask. And they had to put these huts up in the Great Court, which were used as extra classrooms. And you can see this is actually a very staged photograph of the boys having their lessons in the Great Court. Now, this was for a newspaper article in the Times, in actual fact. And a lot of the time, they were actually in the palace itself. Now, you can see this is the Great Hall, and that's where the boys had their meals. And you can also see that the doors have these black curtains because, again, we had to have blackout. And I just want to show you a picture of what the Great Hall normally looks like. Okay, so that's what it looks like today. And there's the door that you saw a moment ago with the curtains. And you can see it has all these windows, and they're 67 feet up, the windows. So we had blackout curtains on the lower story. The middle section, the Duchess just painted black so that they were blacked out. and the top ones also had curtains. And it was the job of these boys. Can you see there's a column there, and there's another one on the other side. Each column has a spiral staircase inside. So the boys had to climb up the spiral staircase, and they would come out at a little door which takes you onto this ledge which runs all the way around the Great Hall. And there's no balustrade, there's no rope, there's nothing to hold on to. And they had to go up there and do the blackout every day. Didn't have health and safety in those days, let me tell you.
No, and I know the picture's taken from fair bit back, but to have a staircase in that column, it doesn't look big enough from my perspective.
No, and it's a little bit deceptive, so that you've got the column on the front, and then it's reasonably deep, but it's a very narrow spiral staircase, as you can imagine. So just to go back to the boys, so they ate there, they slept there, etc., etc. One of the things that they did while they were there, they did lots of fire drill, and this is a Blenheim steam engine. That's actually we lost and is now coming back to Blenheim, but they did fire practice using this. One of their jobs was that they had to go up onto the roof of the palace at night and watch out for incendiary devices. And all they were given was a pair of leather gloves and a stick. So if something fell, you either picked it up and lobbed it off the edge, or you poked it and got rid of it. But what they didn't know was that Hitler had actually given directions that Blenheim was not to be bombed. He wanted it for himself. And if you think about it, what greater triumph than capturing the birthplace of your enemy? And so, as I say, they were unaware of that. So what else was going on? They were digging for victory, as I'm sure you've seen this poster a million times. And so the boys had to help work in the kitchen garden. And they benefited from it, of course, because they were able to eat the vegetables, the fruit that were grown there. But it does make me smile because they clearly didn't come expecting that. And there they are in their football kit, digging. The gardens, the formal gardens, were all turned over to growing vegetables as well. And there are the girls. So this is Sally Spencer on the left. That's Lady Caroline, who went on to be a nurse. And there's Lady Rosemary, she was only 10 when war broke out. So she was still in education, as it were. But there they are sorting out a pile of carrots that have been grown in the Italian gardens. The boys had their lessons, and they, for example, they used various parts of the palace as their classrooms. The old kitchens are as far away from the palace as you can possibly be. And that's where the Duke allowed them to have their science lessons in case they blew the palace up, as you do.
Yeah.
So that was rather wonderful. And they slept in the long library. Now, the long library is 184 feet long, and it is absolutely superb. And there they are. You can see they've each got a bed. They had their lessons sitting on the beds, etc. They had a suitcase each, and they had to live out of their suitcase. There was nowhere to hang clothes. It all had to be done. Mind you, teenagers love that sort of thing. They just throw their clothes left, right, and centre anyway, so that was fine. And we have this amazing organ at one end of the library, and they were allowed to use that for their school prayers and things at night. So that was rather nice. And that's, again, a better view of the library, as it were. The school was split into houses. There was house 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and schoolhouse. And it was schoolhouse that actually slept in the long library. And there was one particular chap called George Chesterton, who I had the great privilege of meeting. And such a lovely man. He was 17 when he came to Blenheim, and he was one of the ones that had to do the blackout. And he said that he actually crawled along the ledge on his hands and knees because he had no head for heights. But what he did do, he was a great cricketer, and he decided that this would be a good place to practice his bowling, and he managed to smash a window. And that I came across in our archive was the cost of the repairs of putting a new pane of glass in the library window, which I thought was rather lovely. But
who got charged for that, Antonia?
So, well, Malvern School got charged for it, yes.
Yes.
They certainly did. And I think, what was it? Oh, it was £1 an hour, 1.5 hours, so £1 and sixpence, so 7.5p they were charged. But one of the other things, just very quickly, if I'm just going to go back. So you can see the organ at the end of the long library, and you can see these pipes, and there are 2,300 pipes. And they vary in size from 30 foot high to little teeny tiny ones that are just a couple of inches. And it wasn't until about 10, 12 years ago that we realized that what had happened to 3 of these little pipes. And the Duke received an anonymous letter. And with the letter were 3 organ pipes. And the letter was from a lady who had recently lost her husband. And she said, "It was my husband's dying wish that I should return these pipes to you. He was at Malvern College during the war, and he slept in the long library, and he had rather a good time." Now, clearly what he'd done was to climb up into the organ loft, and he'd nicked 3 pipes. Now, after the war, because the organ has to be serviced quite regularly, and they realized that these pipes were missing, and they made replacement ones. When we got these back, we took out the replacement ones and we put the originals back. And she ended her letter and she said, "I hope you will forgive his schoolboy prank. And they may not be of use, but they may be of interest." Now, we haven't been able to find out to this day who pinched them. So if there's anyone there watching that knows, then please let us know, because I would love to invite her back to Blenheim to see where her husband was and what he got up to. So
Yeah,
there we are.
absolutely, guys. If you've got any sort of memories or stories or know of this,
Yes.
contact us.
So this photograph was taken on the 28th of July 1940, and the boys broke up for the summer holidays, and they didn't come back to Blenheim. They went back to Malvern College for 1 year. And then they were evacuated again, but this time to Harrow School. So our second invasion was in fact MI5. And what had happened during the Blitz, MI5 lost its headquarters, and loads of records were damaged and lost. So they came to Blenheim Palace, and they worked at Blenheim. They didn't live at Blenheim. They actually lived in one of the Oxford colleges, in Keble College. And for a short time, they'd been housed in Wormwood Scrubs, which was pretty grim, as you can imagine. So they really loved being at Blenheim. And again, I've been so lucky at my time at Blenheim to have met and interviewed these 3 ladies. So the lady on the left was called Anne Finch. The lady on the right at the top, Cynthia Boot. And Cynthia is going to be 96 next year, and she's just incredible. And then the lady at the bottom, Mary Pelly. And they can speak about their time at Blenheim far better than I can. So if I may, I'm just going to run a short 5-minute film. Now, I do apologize that sometimes it's a little bit jumpy, but the sound I think is okay. So if you listen to what they have to say, it's quite astonishing. So just bear with me a moment and let's see what we can do. So here's Mary Pelly.
My father, who was a bursar of Cheltenham College at the time, one of his members of council had a daughter at MI5 who was already here. And you had to be recommended by somebody who was here in order to work here. And I didn't even know this lady, but anyway, she was just told she got to recommend me, so she did. And so that was why I actually came here in January 41.
I was Cynthia Boot when I came here, and I came in 1942, and I only came here because I was too young to join the forces. They wouldn't have me because I was 17, and the War Office would. And then we had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And after that, we never said where we worked. We always said we worked near
War
Oxford.
Office.
Near Oxford.
We were
we were allowed to say...
War Office, I think we were.
That's right. We were allowed to say we were at the War Office, but we were not allowed to say what we did, or what we saw, or how anything worked.
Yeah, right.
I was asked if I would come and work in this office around here, and I wasn't told what I was going to be doing, except that it was important and it was secret, and that was the end of it. And you don't talk about it.
Well, I came in the middle, really, because I didn't come until 42, when it was already quite established. And we lived in Keble College, and in rooms that were supposed to be one person. There were two of us, and the first person that I met was Anne Russell. And she was then Anne Finch, and only I called her Bunty. And I had never met her before, and she has become my lifelong friend. And we lived together with certain appalling rows. She once threw a plate through a glass window. And every morning we would get into these enormous buses, double-deckers. And we all teamed in. We'd got to be there.
8:30, wasn't it?
8:30. Well, the bus was 8:30.
8:30, I think.
Yes, I think we actually started work at 9.
But anyway, we'd arrive, and there were... I'm very bad on numbers, but there were teams of people getting off the buses. And we walked from that main gate that you come into now, across the first courtyard. And the next courtyard was impossible for us to see, because there were at least 6 Nissen huts. And there were different apartments in each Nissen hut. Now, I didn't work in those. Bunty did, but I didn't. And so I turned to the left, and I walked up the main steps, and I came through the main door, and I came into this hall. And it's hugely high, but the downstairs was full of these big filing cabinets.
Oh, right up to the ceiling. Almost.
Right to the ceiling. And we were given letters from various officers, and we would match up the file.
The first job we had was remaking the index, in order to look anybody up and find out whether there was anything against someone, anything like that, because it had been destroyed. They were so stupid, they didn't evacuate from London till after they'd lost all their records. And it was quite interesting, because we used to have Churchill on the phone almost every day, saying, how are we getting on with these records? If the Germans had known that we had lost every possible contact of, their spies or anything like that at all, we would have lost the war, undoubtedly. For some reason, they never found out what MI5 was doing.
The thing I found most interesting was where there were people who were artists or authors or something like that who had files. And I think the thing that was interesting to me was that it wasn't just enemies of the state, it was homosexuals and people like that who could possibly not be completely loyal to our state. And, it's completely out of date now, so it's not something that would be relevant to this generation. But to that generation, these people were suspect.
We were all had a reference ourselves as employees in the index, and I then found that one of my uncles had a reference, and I wondered what he'd done. Well, that he was a clergyman, and he had had some leading communist preach in his church. Only once. Don't suppose he knew who he was.
That was a very strange thing for me, that these people could be traitors because of their particular orientation or because they'd visited Russia or because they'd visited Germany before the war. Nobody ever spoke, and everybody will tell you that, but nobody ever spoke. And we never said that we were in Blenheim. And I didn't tell anybody I was in Blenheim until about 5 years ago. Not at all. But it was very precious to us because it was such a beautiful place to work. I couldn't believe it, it was so beautiful. And Winston came round once, and that was absolutely wonderful. He visited the registry. We were told.
Did he come to the registry?
Came round with me.
Because I was reading something about all this the other day, and somebody had written, and they said there was no record of him ever having actually come personally, but he did.
Well, I saw him. He came through to see us, and there was one person who was a bit of a show-off, and she dropped a lighted match into her wastepaper basket so that he would notice that there was a congregation. And he said, "Oh my God, what have you done there?" or something like that. And so she said, "I spoke to him." Because we did absolutely honour him. He was our great leader. We wanted to hear what he had to say, and we trusted him terrifically, but we also felt we were seeing a statesman, a great, great man. And of course he had this connection with Blenheim. And so it was very exciting for him.
Wow, Antonia.
That's
Lovely memories.
It's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Quite something. Hold on, sorry. There are lots of things I find extraordinary about that. And one of them is the fact that they never, ever, ever spoke about what they did. And, you know, they said to me, it was only when the work at Bletchley Park came to light, and that's not so long ago, that they felt they could start to tell people what they did. You know, and if you think today, you know, our younger generation have, I'm, you know, going off on my hobby horse, they've really forfeited their privacy. You know, anything and everything is on social media. Whereas these women, you know, I spoke to Cynthia quite recently, and I said, "Cynthia, what would have happened if you had actually broken the Official Secrets Act?" And she said they'd have been interned. And apparently, and she said, sent to the Isle of Man. And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And apparently there was an internment camp on the Isle of Man. And it was a huge thing, absolutely huge thing. You know, and all this business about you were suspect if you'd visited Russia or Germany or because of your sexual orientation, because of course you could be open to blackmail. You know, it was just amazing. But so I'm conscious of time, and it would be lovely to get some feedback. So just one last thing. So what happened to Blenheim then afterwards? So MI5 were with us until the end of the war and beyond. And the palace was finally handed back to the family, to the 10th Duke and his family, in 1948. And things had changed. I mean, the social order had changed. There were 32 servants at the palace before the war. There were 11 afterwards, because they joined up, they went off to work in factories. They decided they didn't want a life in service anymore, and who can blame them? You know, so everything had changed. And Blenheim needed an awful lot of money spending on it. And so the Duke and Duchess had a huge decision to make. You know, they could have walked away from it and just left it to go to rack and ruin. They did think about signing it over to the National Trust. And in the Duke's memoirs, he mentions this, and he said that they'd explored that, but they would have had to make an endowment of £100,000, which they didn't have. And so that wasn't an option. So what they decided to do on the 1st of April, 1950, was they opened it to the public. And this is such a fantastic photograph. It was taken on the first day. They used to open 2 or 3 afternoons a week, and it would cost 2 shillings and sixpence to come into the palace. And they expected, you know, 20 or 30 people. This was the sight that greeted them on the first day. And the queue went all the way down to the Oxford Road, which is probably the best part of a mile from the palace front door. And it was so busy that the family had to roll up their sleeves and get on with it as well. So the children sold guidebooks, the Duchess showed people around, their guests showed people around. And in fact, there was one woman who was so excited and so keen to get around the palace, and she had a little baby. She just handed it to the Duchess and went off around the palace and left the Duchess holding the baby. And the Duke, I read somewhere that he thought he would have the palace open for as long as it took to raise money to fix the roof. But of course, 71 years on, we're still open. And in fact, we're open every day now except for Christmas. And the irony was that last year we were celebrating our 70th anniversary, and we had all sorts of things planned. And on the 1st of April 2020, we closed the palace, and we remained closed for 3 months, and unheard of in the palace's history. So there we are, things come full circle.
And you will remain closed because of COVID. That was
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's, that's just the tip of the iceberg on what was happening here during the war.
Wow, guys. What a fantastic kind of look back into history. Things I didn't know there. I guess if they were opening it in 1950, but they had this don't talk about what was going on before that point. I guess you couldn't have talked about the work that the MI5 did in the. So it was just more about the rooms and the location.
Absolutely. It's it really. I think again, one of the ladies said that they were allowed to say that they worked for the War Office, but that was it. And they didn't even talk to each other about what they did. They you can imagine, you're on the bus going back to Keble College. What sort of a day have you had, Lucy? What were you doing today? None of that. Absolutely none of it.
It's so different to the world. And as you said, social media, today. I think that's fascinating. Just to look into some comments, have we got any questions? Lynn at Hawthorne's, this was back when you were talking about it, we're still talking about the poor guys who had to go up the columns to black the windows, hoping none of them fell. Did any of them fall, Antonia?
Apparently not. And again, I just love that story because I know that today, if it snows, we don't let our kids out in the playground anymore. They're not allowed to play conkers. It's just, I think we've lost something. We've lost something.
But then they also sound a lot naughtier than they are now in terms of stealing pipe organs and, that kind of thing, which maybe you wouldn't get away with today. I don't know. Maybe you would. Who knows? Sarah, I don't know which home you are, but many of our residents have visited the palace and have said it's amazing.
Excellent, good. And I hope, I really hope that we can see you in real life. Come and have a picnic. It would be amazing.
Yeah, enjoy the gardens and see the sights for real. How much does it cost Blenheim to run each year? That's Tiffany.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. And again, it depends what's going on because we have a continuing programme of restoration and conservation. So this year, for example, we've got lots of major work going on the bridge. We were due to dredge the lake last year, and that would have cost millions. So there's always something on top of like employee costs and just the cost of keeping the roof in good heart. So it's a huge amount of money, which is why we're still open.
Yeah, and continue to be. Just to keep the upkeep. Now I don't have any more questions, but we'll wait a few minutes for any to come in. In regards to the video, is there an option that we can share the link for people to watch again? Is that possible, Antonia?
I'm sure I'd be able to do something.
So we can share that link just in case if anybody wants to watch again, or I think it's available on Vimeo, but we'll look into the link for you. Okay. Beth says thank you, fantastic talk so much from Rivermead. I think I don't really have any more questions. I don't think. And then, are we getting any more from anybody else? Anybody on YouTube wants to ask anything or share any?
Can anyone remember food rationing? Because that wasn't actually lived. And again, I always kind of, as a child, had this perception that or growing up, that 1945, end of war, everything went back to normal. But of course it didn't, and food rationing continued, clothing rationing continued. People, soldiers and people that were serving overseas didn't suddenly reappear. It just took such a long time.
What's the time frame? I mean, just for my interest, between rationing
well,
coming
I
out.
think I'm right in saying, I can't remember when the Queen was married. I can't remember if it was 1951 or a bit earlier, but that's when sugar rationing was lifted, I think, so that they could bake a proper cake for her. So there was all this sort of thing. You assume that everything suddenly gets back to normal, but of course it doesn't. So yeah, there we are. So there's someone that says, Beth Clark, very vivid memories of food rationings into the 50s. Sorry, there was a question about Capability Brown.
Yeah, one of our residents have asked about Capability Brown taking over the guard or the garden. Do you know anything?
Yeah, so we're on Duke number 12, and in 1764, the 4th Duke commissioned Capability Brown to come and landscape the grounds. And we've still got, we're one of the best Capability Brown landscapes. He was here for 10 years, and 1,000 men worked on it and dug the lake out and things. I mean, again, that's a whole subject in itself, really.
That will have cost a pretty penny, and no wonder they kept the doors open.
That did cost a pretty penny, I can tell you.
Paul has just mentioned here, I think sweet rationing went on until about 1955.
Wow.
Maybe sugar was left off at the Queen there. Great, thank you so much, Antonia. I think we've had some really lovely questions and comments, and I think that's a really nice look back at the history of Blenheim and during the World War. I mean, what was shocking, and I'll just say now before we end, the idea that we didn't know, and anyone at Blenheim and Winston didn't know, that Hitler didn't want Blenheim to be destroyed. But you wouldn't know that until obviously years later, and you go through all these procedures, protocols to keep everybody safe, and you were actually okay. You weren't a target.
No, and it's interesting because neither was Oxford, because again Hitler wanted that. Because certainly if you think Blenheim sits in 2,000 acres of land, now I think I can't imagine that I'd be a very good bomber, but I think I could probably hit Blenheim with a bomb. You can't miss it. It's such a sitting target. So there you go.
Interesting. Tiffany would love to know more about Capability Brown another time, please. Smiley face. So maybe that's something we can look into.
Yeah, we can do you a talk of the gardens. We can do a virtual tour of the gardens.
There we go. That's lovely. I heard it here first. We'll take that. Hugh Middleton says the residents really enjoyed the lovely talk and we're happy to find out more, lots more information about the palace. Hawthorne's really loved it. I've just got some lovely comments coming through. And none on YouTube at the present time. So thank you so much, Antonia. You are wonderful as always. Thank you to everybody that joined today. I was really fascinated with the talk, so I hope you were. And obviously this is recorded, so it can be watched later. It's on the Life Enrichment YouTube playlist, so you can watch it back. And it looks like we're seeing Antonia again for a talk on the garden at some point.
I would love to. And thank you so much for having me back. It's lovely. Big virtual hug to you all.
Absolutely. You're very dear to us, so thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I'll send the comments through because some people are writing really nice stuff. So brilliant. Okay, guys, well, have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll see Antonia in the future months. And the next event we have is on the 6th of July, where I believe we visit some puffins. So that's very exciting.
Wow.
Watch out for more information on that. Take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you later.
Bye.